Good morning, members of the Committee of Finance, sports staff, radio listeners, support staff, radio listeners, TV viewers, those following via social media, and members of the media, as well as a special welcome to the guests in the Tribune today, which is the 6th grade of the Sint School, who are here for the beginning part, at least the opening part of this meeting that we have with the Central Bank, learning about government in St. Maarten. So special welcome to you as well. Welcome to the Minister of Finance and your support staff, as well as representatives of the Central Bank, Mr. Doornbosch and Ms. Lofo Wong. We have established a quorum of 9 members. Please stand for a moment of silence. Thank you very much. I have received notice of absence from the following members: MP Solange Duncan and MP Christophe Emmanuel. I look to the floor at the members of Parliament to see if any other members have notifications. MP George, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to the Chair, my colleagues in Parliament, of course, our guest from the Central Bank of Curacao, St. Maarten, our Minister of Finance, and of course, our special guest sitting in the Tribune. Madam Chair, I just want to take this opportunity to just extend our deepest sympathy and condolences to the persons of the country of Guyana, who, as we all probably have heard, there was a fire that took place last week where about 20 persons died, children, as a matter of fact, and there are some who are also hospitalized. So I want to take this time to extend to the family, the friends, our deepest sympathy and condolences, because the fact is, it is a tragedy when something like this takes place, but especially when it has to do with children whose future is lost. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Pontiflet. No other notifications. Therefore, we will proceed. We have as agenda points for this meeting, number 1, presentation on the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder. Number 2, agenda point number 2, development of and at the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten. And number 3, the way forward for Parliament on tax reform. Agenda points 2 and 3 were requested by MP Wescot-Williams. However, after agenda point 2, we will adjourn and Parliament will continue to deliberate on agenda point number 3 for the way forward on tax reform. We go over to agenda point 1, presentation on the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder. On April 11th, Parliament received a letter from the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten with the request for a meeting with the above-mentioned agenda point. This document is registered as incoming document IS/689/22-23 dated 11th of April 2023. All members received a copy of this document via email, and it can also be found on the P Drive of Parliament. I would now like to give the floor to the Minister of Finance, Mr. Ardwell Irian, for any introductory remarks and presentation. Minister, you have the floor.
Good morning to the Chair, good morning, Griffier, good morning to the members of Parliament, and good morning to our special guests and the Central Bank, President Doornbosch and Raquel Folong. The Central Bank will begin the presentation on the Caribbean Guilder, so I'll ask to hand the floor over to the Central Bank to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Madam Chair, dear members of Parliament, Honourable Minister, dear guests of the Sint School, good morning to the people of St. Maarten. Thank you very much for this opportunity this morning to share with you information on the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder at the end of 2024 and to address possible questions that may arise. Before I would like to ask the chair to give the floor to Ms. Lo-Fo Wong, Director of the Sint Maarten Office of the Central Bank, I would like to say just a few words on the relation between the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder and the more fundamental discussion on the monetary and exchange rate regime of Sint Maarten, and then in particular in relation to dollarization and digital currencies. In September 2021, we presented our position paper on the pros and the cons of dollarization for Sint Maarten. The position paper was based, amongst others, on the special issues paper that was presented just before by the International Monetary Fund. In the position paper, we concluded that the fixed exchange rate system has served as an anchor for financial stability for more than 50 years in Sint Maarten, and that the benefits of introducing the dollar as an official currency for Sint Maarten didn't seem to outweigh the cost, and in particular didn't seem to outweigh the risk at this point in time. On October 6, 2022, we presented our findings here in Parliament and we debated its conclusions. But it's important to say that no final decision has been taken on dollarization by the government. It's important to emphasize, therefore, that the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder in 2024 is not directly related to the decision about the choice between maintaining your own currency on the one hand and dollarization on the other hand. If Sint Maarten should choose at some point to dollarize, this will require a wide range of institutional reforms, and therefore a transition period of at least 5 years would need to be considered. In the meantime, it is urgent and it is necessary to replace the outdated Netherlands Antilles Guilder with a new Caribbean Guilder, as we will be further explaining in the presentation. And I believe a similar argument holds for debates on the digitalization of money and a future introduction of a central bank digital currency. We see many exciting new technological developments in the payment system, and we have introduced instant payments ourselves together with the banks in the beginning of 2022. And we're working hard to also introduce mobile person-to-person payments, in-store payments, and domestic e-commerce payments. And this work will continue in parallel with the preparation for the introduction of the Caribbean Guild. However, our analytical work on a central bank digital currency has been slowed down. What we have seen is that more than 60 central banks around the world, amongst them ourselves, are studying the benefits and the risk of introducing a central bank digital currency, being a digital form of cash provided to the public. Some countries are already experimenting with this. However, until now, with very limited success. Digital cash has been brought into circulation via apps, but its use in transactions has been limited. And an important reason for this is that it has limited interoperability with the existing payment system. And on the other hand, the existing payment system has become more efficient. But this is not true for cross-border payments. Cross-border payments are still very slow, opaque, and expensive. And that is the reason why we have joined a working group together with central banks in the Curacao region to study whether it is possible and how it could be possible to take the advantages of new technology and use them to further improve also cross-border payments. And although developments go very fast, payments in Sint Maarten are still overwhelmingly done in cash. When we studied and surveyed in Sint Maarten the payment behavior of consumers, we found that more than 80% of the respondents preferred their payments for purchases to be in cash. And 69% still preferred to pay their bills in cash. So for that reason, our conclusion is that for the time being, and for the time being is 1 to 5 years, it is still very important for cash and therefore to introduce the new Caribbean Guilder in Sint Maarten. And with that, Madam Chair, with your permission, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Lo Fo Wong to give the presentation on the introduction and the preparations for the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder in 2024, end of next year.
Thank you, Mr. Doornbos. Ms. Lo Fo Wong, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Madam Chair, sorry. With protocol having been established, I will proceed with the presentation at hand. The Caribbean Guilder is, we're going to implement the Caribbean Guilder in the second half of 24. And the question that arises is, what are the things that we are going to be talking about today? Is the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder. We're going to talk about how we're going to, as the central bank, intensify our involvement with the stakeholders in the coming months. How this will affect the cash and digital payments in the islands. And also, finally, if there are any questions and feedback, we welcome those. The main question is always the why. Why are we coming with a Caribbean Guilder at this moment? In 2010, the islands decided that there was a constitutional reform where we have one monetary union with a common currency and a common central bank. But that was in 10-10-10. At the moment in May 2023, we still not have a new Caribbean Guilder. And the question is, why did that not happen? One of the reasons, therefore, is that at the moment when that happened in 10-10-10, there was still a lot of supply of the Netherlands Antilles currency, so there was no sense of urgency to implement it or to rush that as well. One of the things that also delayed an implementation was that the conversations on dollarization kept on coming back. I think Mr. Doornbos alluded to that in extent, so it's not something that I will further go into. But at the end of the day, when the permission was given by the countries to proceed, we took that as an opportunity to make that happen. We started many times, and the last time that we started was right before COVID. But of course, due to the country measures that were requested, we took a step back and we waited the outcome of that, and we finally proceeded a few years ago. It is important to understand that the Caribbean Guilder or the Antillean Guilder has some limitations as it is. We realize that, and those limitations will make that it could lead to confidence or lack of confidence in the currency that there is, and also erode the safety and efficiency of the payment systems. One of them is that the Netherlands Antilles Guilders that we're talking about, it's a country that does not exist anymore. After 10-10-10, the Netherlands Antilles ceased to exist. What happened as well is that we're looking at outdated security features. The last time that the banknotes specifically were adjusted was in 1998. That is 25 years ago. Normally, currencies are adjusted every 7 to 10 years with more up-to-date security features. So we already missed 2 cycles in that effect, and the notes that we have are severely outdated. What also plays is that the banknote paper that we use and also the alloy that we use for the coins and for the banknotes are not readily available anymore, and it's very difficult to get them at this stage and to have the notes printed the way they are currently are. Another factor that plays in is that the current banknote paper that we used, Johan Enschede from the Netherlands, stopped printing banknotes. We reached out to other banknote printers, but they are unable to print the current banknotes as it is, so that would also entail that we would have to do an upgrade. So if we do an upgrade, we might as well go the full route instead of patching. And finally, at this stage, because we are not in the position to print anymore, we cannot get the coins anymore as easily, we need to replenish stock. And that is a factor that plays in as well. So yes, if you're looking at timing, why now? Why the urgency? Why the sense of urgency? It is urgent, and that's why we really have a date implemented that we want to do this by next year. So the timing, in our opinion, is right. If we're looking at the cost of the project, we estimate it to be around 15 million guilders, which will be to replenish the cash that is in circulation and to also make sure that there is stock available for the coming 4 years. I already mentioned that we're aiming to do this in the second half of 2024. Also, the currency code, which at the moment is A and G, will change to XCG. The X stands for, let me explain it like this. Once you're dealing with two countries that have a joint currency, you're not allowed to use, you cannot use the C for Curacao and the S for St. Maarten as a starting letter because you're dealing with two countries. So the common rule is that you use an X, and the CG stands for Caribbean Guilder. So the currency code will change. If you're looking at the specifications in the denominations, the banknotes will see some changes. We will have the 200 guilders, 100 guilders, 50 guilders, 20 guilders, and 10 guilders. So the 200 guilders will replace the 250, and the 20 guilders will replace the 25. The coins will be the 5 guilders, 1 guilders, 50 cents, 25 cents, 10 cents, 5 cents, and 1 cent. These rules and regulations of what we need to introduce is all stipulated in the Regeling Gemeenschappelijk Geldstelsel Curaçao and Sint Maarten. That's a rule, common currency for Curaçao and Sint Maarten, where all these stipulations are mentioned. If you're looking at the substrate or the material that we use for the Caribbean Guilder, for the banknotes it will remain cotton, and the coins we will be using a different material that is what is currently used. The main reason, the dimension and the weight, the banknotes, the size will remain the same. The main reason why you have done this is to make it the adaptation for the machines as easy as possible. If you also have to change the machines, the readability of the notes, because as the security features will change, having one thing less to worry about will make it a lot easier. And the coins, all the coins will be round, will be different dimensions, and what we will also have done is that the weight of the coins will be distinguished from the Netherlands and Zillion Guilder, and also foreign currency coins around the island, so that we don't have that our coins or other countries, their 5 cents can be used here as a 5 guilder coin.
Ms. Lofo Wang, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I forgot to mention earlier on that I would take a little bit of a pause during the presentation to allow the school students and their teachers to leave. And before I let them adjourn the meeting, I wanted to mention to them that you had an excellent opportunity this morning to listen in on a new currency that the island is going to have next year. And it would have been nice to actually have some in hand for you to see, but at least you have firsthand evidence, firsthand information on what is to come in the country. So when you see that the currency actually comes into circulation, you will already have known how it happened and the background to it based on the presentation that we had this morning so far before you leave. So thank you so much, Sister Maarten. I forgot to mention earlier on that I graduated from Sister Maarten School before I moved away, and the griffier next to me also was at Sister Maarten School. So it's nice to see the green and white in the Parliament halls. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned for 2 minutes. Welcome back to this Committee of Finance meeting. Thank you, Ms. Lo-Fa-Wong, for the short interruption to allow the students to leave. Before I give you back the floor, I just wanted to mention for the record that there was interest from the members of Parliament to have a copy of the presentation, if that's okay. So we have the affirmation from Ms. Lo-Fa-Wong that we will indeed get that presentation. You have the floor. If you can just press the, thank you.
Yes. So let's proceed. Where were we? The exchange of the Netherlands Antilles Guilder. How will that work? It will be for a period of 30 years. The first year will be at the commercial banks only, and thereafter at the central bank. That will be a period of 29 years. Very important is that all anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism rules and regulations will need to be taken into account. The rate, also a question that we have been hearing a lot, or some concerns that there are. An Antillean guilder will remain the same value as it currently is. So an Antillean guilder will be a 1 XCG. There will be no loss, there will be no when you wake up in the morning your money is less worth, it will be the same. It will be when you go to the supermarket, if the price is now 1 Antillean guilder, the price will be 1 Caribbean guilder. So there will be no change there. As well, a question that is also that we've heard a lot, the peg of a US dollar to the Antillean guilder is now 1 Antillean guilder is 1 US dollar. That will be the same. 1 US dollar will be 179 Caribbean guilder. So that too will be a conversion of, like I call it, will be a same conversion as there. There are no changes in that peg. Mr. Doornbos mentioned it already. That's a peg that has been there for more than 50 years. And with our monetary policy and the change that there is now, this will not change either. There will be a co-circulation period. The intention is that we will have both currencies in use for 3 months, and that the public will pay in cash in Antillean guilders. That will still be possible. But the intention is that all exchange will be done in Antillean guilder, so that slowly but surely the Antillean guilder will be taken out of circulation. Any vending machines and cash payment terminals that are out there, those will be changed and adapted in the co-circulation period. It's important that from the moment we really introduce the Caribbean guilder, that all the ATMs and the XCGs will dispense XCGs, and the electronic payment system will also be done in XCG. So we're working very closely with the commercial banks and also adopting our own systems to make sure that we are ready for set date. We see this conversion as an opportunity. It will be an opportunity to come out with currency that will be secure against counterfeiting. The coins and the banknotes will reflect the identity and the history and the culture of both Curacao and Sint Maarten, and it will also be serve as a business card for the islands. If you're looking at how will we reaching out to the public in the months to come, and our stakeholders in general, our first step was that we had to work with the government to receive the green light to proceed with the introduction of the currency and to start making some amendments in the months to come on the legislation. What we're also doing is an intense roadshow on interviews, presentations, on websites and social media. Perhaps it would be good to mention here that on May 30th at 11 o'clock, we will doing a presentation for the general public focused on the Caribbean Guilder, and we call it the nitty-gritty on the Caribbean Guilder. It will be streamed on the Facebook page of the central bank, and government was also gracious to allow us their portal and share this information on their portal as well. So it will also be shared on the Facebook page of the government of Sint Maarten. We did a similar session in Curacao last week. That was in Papiamento. And we'll be doing a specific session in English for the public of Sint Maarten next week on the 30th. So I would request everybody to share this information and make sure that we have as much people listening in so that this information that can be shared with the general public of Sint Maarten. One of our key stakeholders are the banks. They have a key role in the cash circulation of the payments, of course. They have to adapt their cash processing system, and they also have to adapt their electronic payment systems. And we're working very closely with them to make sure that this happens in a timely manner. Of course, you have other companies and institutions. I mean, they might have to change their, let's say, supermarkets. They might have to change their readability of their systems, whereby ANG will now read XCG, but that is something that can also happen after. And if you're looking at the general public, important, of course, is the introduction period and the exchange period in the coming year. We will be doing sessions on how to authenticate a Caribbean Guilder, what you have to look for, what are the security features. We have to be very careful that, of course, this is a time that a lot of Antillean Guilder will be in circulation and will be brought back to the banks, that we have to be careful for counterfeit, because there's going to be a lot of money in circulation, so that is also an area of concern. And we also know that a lot of people might not have obtained their money in an illegal way and have it at home. We have to make sure that that money that is being brought to the commercial banks know that they are very aware that all the AML and the counter CFT guidelines are followed, and that we are aware that that could be a gray area to come. One of our tasks is to promote a safe and efficient payment system in the payment traffic in the countries. When I talk about payment traffic, I'm not talking about digital payments, but I'm also talking about cash. So we have seen that digital payments are increasing and they're gaining popularity. However, the countries are still very much cash-based. Mr. Doornbos mentioned the numbers that we saw in our financial inclusion survey. So it's that is one of the reasons why we are very adamant with an introduction of a new currency. Financial inclusion is also part of that payment traffic. What have we seen? The unbanked population in the same survey that we did is 12% in Curacao and 17% in Sint Maarten. Financial inclusion cannot happen without access to financial systems. So we have submitted legislation for a basic bank account to the government of both Curacao and Sint Maarten, and they are now going through the legislative process. And we are stressing on this, that this happens prior to the introduction, so that those that do not have the opportunity to change their funds, that they have a bank account, that they could do that now. So what mentioned that we're looking at both cash and digital payment in this process. And if we're looking at the digitalization of payments, it is important that we create the right infrastructure for a safe and sound digital payment systems. I think this brings me to the end of it. What I wanted to say, that this is a process that involves all of us. We will need everybody, so we're really counting on each and everyone to make it happen. If you have any further questions, you can get the information on the website of the government of the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten. There's also an email address where you can get information on, that is the Caribische-Gulden@centralbank.cw, where you can also send any additional questions that you have. Thank you for your time. Look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Lofo Wong and Mr. Doornbos, for the presentation and the information. Before I go to the floor to see if there's any questions from the members of Parliament, due to the experience of whenever we've had central bank in here, most of the time you require little time to answer the questions. And because we are a little bit strapped for time for you here today, I want to look at you and see whether or not, once the members of Parliament ask all of their questions, that you can decide to answer them one time, just to let us know how much time you would need. If you would need some time for us to take a pause in the meeting to adjourn for a few minutes to continue on. I look to the floor to see if there's any members that have any questions. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to you. Good morning to the Griffier, my colleague members of Parliament, the Honorable Minister of Finance, and the team from Central Bank here with us today, and those viewing. Madam Chair, just a couple questions on this issue. I think when I look at the reasons why, the obvious reason that for me, if you talk practicality, is, well, the two things that jump out at me is the security, the fact that I believe it's since 1998. There haven't been any security features, and of course the fact that you can't print anymore. So if you can't print anymore, well, I think it's obvious you need to move on. I mean, put aside whether we want to move to another currency, whether, to me, it's a clear necessity. If you cannot print anymore, that is not a situation you want your central bank in. Because I too was wondering, oh, why? But when I saw that, it's like, oh, well, if you can't print anymore, then I think it's clear the necessity. So I'm not worried too much about the necessity. I do wonder about the transition. That's what I'm worried about, let's say, or have some concerns about. Because on the one hand, I didn't quite see a timeline for a sort of transition period. Is there, if there's someone that's off island for some reason or not going to be here in 2024, they have some savings with them, maybe off island even. If they come here in 2025, will they no longer be able to exchange? So how much time do they have to be able to exchange before the country comes to a point where, no, that's just piece of paper, we're not honoring it? Just what is the cutoff date, if any, that's going to be proposed? In addition to that, I think one of the concerns I was going to bring up was somewhat addressed, and maybe that's why it was added to the presentation, which is the fact that I believe, if I understand, the exchange of the notes will take place in the commercial banking. So let's say not at the central bank office, you're gonna have to go to their commercial banks. Will someone be required to have a bank account to be able to exchange it? So if I'm not a customer of this bank, can I just go to this bank with 5,000 Netherlands Antillians guilders and I will be given the amount? Or do I have to be a customer of that commercial bank? Because that's where it does tie into what I'm very happy to hear, which the minister sent to us in the IPCO documents, and now we hear confirmed, which is in line with the motion of Parliament in terms of getting legislation to Parliament for a basic bank account. This is an example of where, even in the central bank trying to do something, if people don't have bank accounts, so what do we do? How are they going to be able to get this money, which is legal tender, that they deserve to get exchanged? But then if they go to the bank and the bank tells them, oh, sorry, you need to fill in these forms and hopefully in the next 6 months you're going to get your account, then we know that that's not going to work out for people. So I think those two are interconnected. I believe that legislation should be enacted. In my personal opinion, it should be enacted and enforced and being practiced before this transition is being done, because I can understand surveys were done and so on. I want to imagine it's probably a bit more than 17% of the population that might not have bank accounts, because I don't know if we've looked at the fact that there's undocumented people in the country. Are they part of that survey? Would you have to be a resident? And the fact is, whether we like it or not, there are a significant number of undocumented people in our country, and they have guilders. Many of them are paid in guilders for the work that they do. So that being tied together is very important for me to know if those two, the legislation on banking together with this is being done in tandem. I would also like to ask about the rate of the PEG. This is just maybe not from a monetary perspective, but just from a practical perspective. Have we ever considered just making it 1-to-1 for any reason? Is there any consideration for that? I know it's always been 1.79 or 1.8 or whatever. But some countries like Bahamas, Panama have just simply made it a 1-to-1 currency. I can imagine in practice that would be very easy for tourists, for example, to understand. If they see a price as one, it is clear whether that's guilders or dollar, it's $1. But then I can imagine maybe from the financial perspective, in terms of the systems that are already in place, in terms of the 1 cent that you collect as a result of the exchange, maybe there's a monetary benefit to having a different number. I'm just talking from the practicality of the fact that 90% of the people in St. Maarten, especially our tourists, they use the dollar. Have we considered just making it 1-to-1? Also regarding the peg rate, or actually the peg to the dollar, I must say, Madam Chair, to you, Mr. Dornbush has sold me over the years on my position of dollarization, or rather the central bank's position on dollarization. And that has a lot to do with the volatility since especially COVID-19 that we've seen the US dollar gone through, and or other world currencies going through, and having the peg to the dollar definitely was a benefit in our case. So some of the things that they have put in their position paper were really, you could have seen it during COVID-19 especially. Those monetary policies kicked in, and it did help the country. In urgent, catastrophic situations, that's clear. On the other hand, do we need to be concerned in the long term of our peg to the US dollar with the instability or fears of the inflation that the US especially went through, and what effect that directly had on our economy being pegged to the US dollar? There's considerations about whether it should be the euro, whether it should be anything else. I don't know. I think the euro is the only other viable candidate. But has any considerations been given or studies done into the long-term effects of the inflationary system of the US dollar? We can have a situation where, for example, Congress doesn't raise the debt ceiling and immediately the value of the dollar drops 20–25%. What does the central bank do then, now that we're pegged to the US dollar still? And the last question, why are we doing 1 cent coins? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Bryson. I give the floor to MP Brumu for your questions. You have the floor.
Good morning to you, Madam Chair Lady. Pleasant good morning also to my colleague MPs, to the members of the Central Bank here with us, the Honorable Minister and his support staff, the viewing and listening public. I have not a few, but quite a number of questions. The first question through you, Madam Chair Lady, is towards the Central Bank. How does the Central Bank plan to manage potential inflationary pressures during the transition to the Caribbean Guilder to ensure economic stability? What measures are in place to address any potential risk to interest rates and exchange rates during the introduction of this new currency? What strategies does the central bank have in place to educate and inform the public about the benefits and processes associated with the Caribbean Guilder, and to address any concerns or misconceptions? How will the central bank ensure transparency and public trust in its decision-making processes throughout the currency transition? How will the central bank assess the sustainability of the peg and manage potential external shocks or fluctuations that could affect the exchange rate of the Caribbean Guilder? What considerations have been given to alternative exchange rate regimes such as a managed float or a crawling peg, and what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of each approach? What measures are being taken to ensure that banks, businesses, and individuals have sufficient time and support to adapt their systems and practices to accommodate the Caribbean Guilder? How will the central bank monitor and address any potential risk or challenges in the financial sector during the currency transition? Can the central bank provide information on the availability and diversification of foreign currency reserves to support the stability and credibility of the Caribbean Guilder? How does the central bank plan to manage currency risk and ensure an adequate level of reserves to maintain confidence in the new currency? 4 more questions. What updates or amendments are needed in the legal and regulatory framework to accommodate the introduction of the Caribbean Guilder? How will the central bank ensure that the legal and regulatory framework supports a smooth transition and minimizes disruptions for businesses and individuals? Can the central bank provide a breakdown of the anticipated costs associated with introducing the Caribbean Guilder, including printing banknotes, minting coins, updating systems, marketing, and communication? What cost-benefit analysis has been conducted to assess the financial implications of the currency transition, and how will the central bank ensure that the benefits outweigh the expenses? And the final question, can you provide more information on the public information campaign that will be organized to properly educate our citizens? And how long will this campaign be, seeing that we are looking at the second part of 2024? Madam Chair Lady, I will email these questions to the Minister so that you have them readily available. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Thank you, MP Rameau, for the questions. I'll look to the floor. The following MP Pontiflet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me thank Ms. Lofo for the presentation, of course, and good morning once again. Madam Chair, my colleague MP Bryson basically touched on the cardinal points that I wanted to bring forward. I just want to emphasize on some that I believe Mr. Doornbusch mentioned, or sorry, Ms. Lofo mentioned, no, that's correct. Mr. Doornbusch mentioned in his presentation regarding the 80% persons that prefer to pay in cash and the 69% pay their bills in cash. And I believe Ms. Lofo said that a study, financial inclusion survey was done. It is the document that we can get a copy of through you, Madam Chair. Let me go back to this 80%, 69%. And my question through Madam Chair is, when did the policy of the banks change as it regards to the opening of a bank account? Why do I say this? I can go back as far as the 80s when, and I've said this more than once on this floor on other occasions during other meetings that are not related, when immigration was doing some serious raiding and deporting back in the 80s, the largest or the oldest bank in St. Maarten, the director called the then Lieutenant Governor of St. Maarten, Mr. Ralph Richardson, and asked what was taking place. And the challenge was that the bank said that the persons who they were deporting were leaving with their money. Why ask this? Today, I don't think it has changed much with regards to the issue of persons who are undocumented. I would even dare to say without doing research, it has increased. So what is the criteria now? Because what was it then that persons who were undocumented were allowed to open bank accounts? What did change now that today it is a problem? And I'm saying this, Madam Chair, through you. The issue is, for me, is for St. Maarten, for government, for the banks to as much as possible be able to get our hands on the finances of the money that are circulating on St. Maarten. I would have thought it would be easier to allow a person at least to open a bank account, then we can have a track or trace of the monies on St. Maarten. But when they make it difficult, it means like how we would say in the olden days, person put the money under the bed and so on, and then you can almost call it money laundering, but it's not, because the fact is the banks today are making it extremely difficult for persons to open a bank account. So what criteria, what policy was there then compared to today that is more difficult now that we have 80% of persons, 80% prefer to pay in cash, which I understand, but again, and it's 69% that pay bills in cash. We would have thought that in our modern society that person would prefer to use what you call the digital system, but unfortunately, in reality, if you pass on the pawn side and so on, you look at GEBS sometimes, I mean, it is filled with person. You go to TLM on certain days, the line is full of person because why? They are going physically to put their funds or to make sure the bills are paid because they don't trust the system. So I think it has to do more, Madam Chair, through with the issue of how good the internet is working, but at the same time, persons having a difficulty in opening a bank account. As I said, my colleague, MP Bryson, touched on the issue of security features. Mention was made of the transition period, so how long it's going to take to phase out the Antillean Gilder to go to the Caribbean Gilder. So those things, I'm awaiting the answers to those, and if any other question come to mind, Madam Chair, I would like to have the opportunity to present it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, MP Pontiflet. MP Wescot-Williams, you have the floor. MP, can you press it again? Take it off and press it again. My apologies. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Good morning to you. Good morning to my colleagues and our support staff. Of course, a good morning to the Minister and the representatives of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten. Thank you very much for the presentation regarding the introduction of the Caribbean Gilder. And my first question would be whether we have passed the go, no go point. So in other words, we're going with it. No ifs, no buts, no second thoughts, no, so. And connected to that question is my question, so reaching the go point was a decision by the government/shareholders of the central bank. Was an official decision necessary, and has that been taken, signed, and documented, and if that can be shared with Parliament, So from that date, the decision has been taken by those responsible for the decision, and thus we're going forward, and we're going to have to try to make it work as best as it can, but there's no turning back. That's what I would like to get established, and that document that underpins this decision, if that is something that can be shared. The mention was made in the presentation regarding the legislative trajectory, so the legislation that is necessary in connection with this process. Any idea as to a timeline for the legislation? So when is it going to, be drafted, presented to government, etc.? Because I would imagine, and if not, I stand to be corrected, that both countries will have to simultaneously also deal with their legislation regarding this. So is there sort of a timeline for the legislation? And then thirdly, and actually the last question, because the presentation was pretty clear, and that's and I thanked you for that before. The mention was made of the unbanked part of our populations, and I recall it being 12% on Curacao and 17% on St. Maarten. Any comparative numbers in terms of other similar economies, similar countries/islands where that number is concerned? So any comparative numbers where that particular matter is concerned. Other than that, again, Madam Chair Lady, I want to thank the Central Bank. I look forward, and this is, for me, an important takeaway from the meeting in terms of the process going forward, the information to the public. I heard of the one scheduled for the 30th of May. I have already started to share that and basically telling people, get the information. I didn't say from the horse's mouth, that would be a little, but I did say, get it straight from the source so that the St. Maarten people too can be engaged in the process and get their necessary questions answered. So thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Look forward to receiving the answers on those basically 3 questions. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Wescott-Williams. MP Gums, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to you, my colleagues, the Central Bank and the Minister, and those joining us online. Madam Chair, I just have one question. Actually, one of my questions was also related to what MP Bryson brought up about the pegging rate, so the one-to-one potential, like the Bahamian dollar, for example. But to kind of go further on that, I just wanted to ask what measures could be, in the Central Bank and the Ministry's opinion, implemented to, I guess, encourage then the use of this new currency. You know, a lot of reports have said that we are de facto dollarized because most of our transactions in the retail market, whether it's housing, et cetera, whether you go to the movies, is primarily based, on dollars. We are a very dollar-minded society. So just to kind of ask what could be put in to then encourage the use more so of this incoming Caribbean guilder over what has been going on so far. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Wescott-Williams. MP Bryson, MP Gums, my apologies. MP Bryson, I see that you need the floor again. You have the floor.
Thank you. I did miss one question, and that has to do with the abbreviation, the XCG that is proposed or that's going to be used. In the past, as was mentioned, currently in the eyes of the central bank, the Netherlands Antillean guilder, florin, as it's been called, was ANG, but all of our legislation has always had it listed, let's say, in legislative text as NA, I think, italic F. That has been a difference. What is going to happen going forward legislatively? Let's say from the moment this law passes Parliament, every besluit, every landsverordening, every further legislation that comes out will have to use something. What is proposed to be used? Is it going to be XCG? Is it going to be CAG? That's something important to consider, and I would expect that there needs to be also a legislative transition where all these laws before refer to NAF, and now it's going to be referring to something else. Just has some thought been put into the written legislative aspect of the abbreviation?
Thank you, MP Bryson. MP Bijlani, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning to you. Good morning to Graffier. Good morning to the Honorable Minister, representative from the Central Bank, and my colleagues. Most of my questions have been asked, but I have a couple of them. Besides Curacao and St. Maarten, which countries will be adopting the Caribbean guilders? And when you have a bank account, it says Antillean guilders on your account. So now when it changes from Antillean to XCG, will individuals have to go to the bank to have those changed, or will that be automatically done? And the way the system in business is adopting the US dollars and guilders, will that be the same way, or will any new changes will be brought in with the Caribbean guilders? Thank you all.
Thank you, MP Bijlani. I see that there are no further questions from the members of Parliament. While I had some questions, I'm going to reserve them for the second agenda point. Look to Mr. Dornbusch to see, or Minister of Finance, you have the floor.
Yes, we'll answer some of the questions that we can now off the top, and then the rest that we didn't get to, we'll send in writing. And just a couple of summarized answers regarding the promotion of the Caribbean Guilder. I think the Central Bank, and I did appreciate that since the decision started of the process, if you go on the Facebook page and the radio and so forth, you see a lot of promotion already to the public explaining about this process, what's coming and so forth. So the marketing of it has already started. So I want to be clear on that. The boosting up of the marketing will exponentially grow as we get closer and closer to the time. And there was another question regarding to the go or no go. I think it was also mentioned in the presentation that this go or no go was decided for us in 2009. Going into country status, that was part of the agreement that we will have a new currency. So actually we are 13 years late with the go on this decision point. And I'll let the President answer the questions that he can now answer on his own.
Thank you, Minister. And Mr. Dornbusch, you have the floor if you can just press your mic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of Parliament, for these very good questions. Some of them need some thinking, actually, before you can really answer them, but I will try as good as I can to answer these questions. Some of them I know, of course, on the top of my mind. So if I take them in order, I would like to start by the very good question by Member of Parliament, Mr. Bryson. So the timeline for the transition period is 30 years. So it's 1 year at your commercial bank, and then 29 years at the central bank. So if you are abroad for a number of years and you find some Antilles guilders somewhere in your house, then you have to go back to Sint Maarten, go to the central bank, and there you can exchange your Antillean guilders for Caribbean guilders. And so, yes, and it is important, of course, then to observe the AML CFT requirements. The minister is alluding me to this. So, will someone be required to have a bank account to be able to change at its commercial bank? At the moment, that is the understanding. So, only clients of commercial banks can change their Antillean guilders at their commercial banks for Caribbean guilders. And the reason is basically the AML CFT requirements. You have to know your customer. And so, if somebody, and that is very important indeed, doesn't have a bank account, which we know it's, 17%, and maybe it's even higher, then this person needs to go to the central bank and can then change its Antillean guilders for Caribbean guilders at the central bank here in Philipsburg. So we do feel this legislation on basic bank account is very important. We would like to have this in tandem, so in advance, so to facilitate people to have a bank account, to have a relationship with a commercial bank. That would also relieve some of the burden on the central bank to do the exchange. But it is really depending on the legislative process. In Curacao, it is now just had the advice of the CER, and it's been sent back to the government. In Sint Maarten, it is with the legal, with the Council of Ministers. Okay. With the Council of Advice. Okay, so in a similar stage of the process. So then, and this is the one I needed to think about. So what if you make it, you change the peg to the US dollar? So the Member of Parliament, Mr. Bryson, asked this question, and Member of Parliament, Ms. Gams, asked this question. And obviously that has wide-ranging implications, because your competitive position will change. And so your real effective exchange rate will change if suddenly you become richer, all in all, because suddenly your Antillean guilder is worth 1.79 more than before. So that is going to normally trigger inflation in the country to ensure that you are again at the same relative position as before. So in the end, it will create quite some uncertainty around the competitive position of your prices, how businesses will operate in their cost base. But if you want to answer this in a more elaborate way, it's kind of an economic textbook kind of analysis what you would then get. But if you want to answer it in a simple way, it's really triggering inflation and it's changing your competitive position. And that will be the short answer. Is there some concern on the long term that we are being pegged to the US dollar? And I think that is also an important and a relevant question to ask. But it is important to understand that the reason why we are pegged to the US dollar is because we are a small country, and most of our imports and exports are with the United States. And that means that the exchange rate with the United States and the way we trade will remain the same, even if the position of the dollar internationally will change. An advantage of this back to the US dollar has been that the United States has a very good inflation trajectory. So in the United States, compared to many countries in the world, inflation has been low. Also, at this point, we see that the reputation of the Federal Reserve to fight inflation is still strong. We see inflation coming down. I mean, across the world, inflation has been above 8%, but as in other countries, inflation in the US is coming down, although slower than initially expected and certainly slower than what is desired. But that is the main reason why we have been pegged to the US dollar. So why are we still introducing 1 cent? So the simple reason is because it's in the law. So it has been decided in 2009. It's in the law, in de wet gemeenschappelijk geldstelsel, that we have this 1 cent. You could legitimately ask the question whether we should not produce it anymore because it's not being used as much for making payments. They end up most of the time in little cups at homes. They never come back, and sometimes you have to restock, and then it costs 2.5 cents to make 1 cent. So from an economic perspective, there's no real reason. There is some concern that if you would round up, so you would round at 5 cents, that this could trigger a little bit of an inflationary effect. But that's the main reason why we're still using 1 cent. Going forward, I guess this is something that will be evaluated once every so many years. So the legislation, a few questions on the legislation going forward. The most important legislation is being decided. So we have legislation introducing the Caribbean Guilder. We have legislation introducing the denominations of the banknotes and the coins. And so what is required is legislation to set the date. And that is a landsbesluit houdende algemene maatregel that needs to be taken in both countries. We haven't got a firm date yet, so that needs to be decided over the coming months, I would say. So there's a few changes that we would like to see in the legislation that has to be put to Parliament, and one of them is the currency code. So in the legislation that we have, it's still called CMG. And we tried to get this currency code from the international standard setter. In the end, we didn't get it. So they stick to the demand that if you have several countries joining one currency, it should be starting with an X. Obviously, we made the case that in the euro area, there's the E, starting with the E, but they didn't treat us equally with the euro area. And so they stick to the X, and so that's a little change that we need to make in the legislation, but we don't require this legislation to be passed before we introduce the Caribbean Guilder. So that was a question, and I think, Madam Chair, if it is possible to allow the Minister also to, or didn't you want to add? Did you want to make a point on this?
No, on the previous one.
Okay, so please.
Thank you, Mr. Dornbusch. Before I give the floor to the Minister, I just wanted to acknowledge MP Wescot-Williams. I did see that you had the button pressed down. As soon as they're done with the questions, I will pass the floor back to you. Minister, you have the floor.
Yes, in regard to the 1 cent topic also, the central bank did come to the board shareholders asking if we were interested in removing the 1 cent, and from our position we were, and the other position from the other shareholder was not. And that's also another reason.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Dornbusch?
Yes, thank you for this additional clarification. So then I will start with the questions by Member of Parliament, Ms. Romou, if I pronounce that correctly. So one of the questions that she asked, and I have most of them, but I missed two, but how does the central bank's manage the inflationary pressures of this exchange rate conversion. And so the most important thing is that there is no exchange rate conversion. That's why the inflationary pressure we hope not to see, actually, because the conversion will be one-on-one. There is not going to be any change in the exchange rate. And so the reason why, and that's firmly in mind of many people still, is that there were inflationary pressure when you had a currency conversion was when in the Netherlands or in other European countries, when the move was made to the euro, there was a change in the exchange rate. So before there was 1 guilder and that changed, and this guilder changed to the euro, but not one-on-one, but the guilder was changed by 2.203 something, I think I recall, if I recall this correctly. And so the reason why we feel that this inflationary pressure should not arise and will not arise is because it's one-on-one. So you don't need to change your prices on your menu. If you have now a price that is 17 Antillian guilders, you can just leave it there, 17 Caribbean guilders, and change over time maybe the currency code, but that's about it. We are monitoring this, obviously. It's something of interest, but I do not feel this is something that should happen. We will inform the public. I think there's quite an elaborate campaign. The minister also alluded to this, but this will gain more traction over time. So we've started now, and we will become more and more specific as soon as time passes. Obviously, the next important communication point will be when we have set a firm date. It is important for us to encourage transparency regarding this process, but overall also regarding the operations of the central bank and what will change when we change to the Caribbean guilder. There was also a question how we assess the sustainability of the PEC long term, and the considerations given to other exchange rate regimes, and an example was given of a floating exchange rate regime. And we did address this question in our position paper that we published in September 2021. There we listed all the different options for exchange rate regimes, and there we also stated that actually dollarization, for example, and the fixed exchange rate regime that we have now are very close substitutes. If you would move to a different exchange rate regime, like a fundamentally different exchange rate regime, such as a floating peg that was mentioned by a Member of Parliament, Romu, then that would be a substantial change. And the reason why this is used in many countries, but not in ours, is because this is a small country, relatively. So the share of our imports and exports is 70–80%. And so if you would then use a floating exchange rate regime, this would not have really an impact in that you can better absorb economic shocks. Because in the end, you cannot really change your prices because 80% of your prices will be related to the imports that you have. And so you will have the costs, like changing exchange rate is creating more of uncertainty, and so the cost of this flexible exchange rate you will have, but you don't have the benefits. But in the end, you cannot really change your prices in economic terms compared to your competitors. So that is the most important reasons why actually I would say almost all small islands countries have a fixed exchange rate and not a floating rate regime. The sustainability of the PEC, that was the previous question, is good because we've shown that we can keep it for more than 50 years. That's a very good track record, I would say. But it's also because we have a reserve position that is sound. We measure this reserve position by taking our reserve position and then seeing how many months of imports we can pay with this reserve position. Suppose no dollars coming in anymore, then how long can you still pay your imports with dollars that we have in the reserve position? And so the norm internationally is that you should have 3 months of imports being covered by your reserves, and we are now at 4.5 months. Before, we used to be in the pandemic, it was extraordinarily high because of the high loans that we received from the Netherlands that came in dollars. So it had been 7 months, which was quite extraordinary given our current account deficit. But it came down, and it's probably going to come down a little bit more. But up till now, we are very comfortable in our reserve position, and that's an indicator for the sustainability of our PEC. It is important indeed that businesses get sufficient time to adjust their systems. That's why we started the consultation with the stakeholders, asking them how much time is needed. It depends, of course, what kind of business we are talking about. If you think about actually banks will have the most, will need most time because they have to make the most fundamental changes in their system, but also software developers, there will be a demand for that because it needs to be changes in bookkeeping systems of businesses. So it is important that we allow sufficient time for this. How do we monitor risk in the financial system during the transition? We don't expect financial risks from this transition. We do expect AML, CFT risks. In that sense, risk management of bank is going to be very important. We also expect some operational risks in banks, and so that's something that we monitor and are in discussion with. Financial risk, it doesn't seem the most likely as the risks that are there. We do monitor those. We've presented this week, or last week actually, the financial stability report in which we assess the financial soundness of the 49 financial institutions that we have operating in Curacao and Sint Maarten. I think that has also answered the question on how we manage our currency risk and the adequacy of our reserve levels. The updates needed in the legislative framework, I answered in my response to the questions of Member of Parliament, Mr. Bryson. We have not provided a breakdown in the cost of producing the currency. We have only submitted the 15 million. Obviously, there is a breakdown. It's a very detailed breakdown, but we haven't published that, and I don't think we have any plans of publishing that. That is sort of proprietary information also for the ones that providing. So we did provide, or we did announce who are going to be our suppliers. So the Royal Canadian Mint is going to be the supplier for our coins, and Crane currency is going to be the supplier of our banknotes, and that is something that we, I think, published 2 weeks ago or so. So more information on public information campaign will come along as we go, and so I expect that to be in 3 or 4 months actually, when we have the date, and then we will also show what is the moment that we will show the how the banknotes will look, what are the exact security features, etc. The advice is not to do that too much in advance, also to don't give an opportunity to counterfeiters to prepare, but at the same time provide the public with enough information. The cost-benefit analysis of introducing the Caribbean Guilder, I mean, it wasn't really a choice, so there's not a very detailed cost-benefit analysis because the law stipulated that we had the Caribbean Guilder, we couldn't print anymore the Netherlands Antilles Guilder, so there was not really a choice. And obviously the cost changed a bit over time because when we first did the study and assessed the cost, the cost level was very different from what it is because the cost of metals has gone up quite dramatically in recent years, and that also had implications for our analysis of the cost that we incur. Then I am moving to the questions of a Member of Parliament, Mr. Pantoflet. So yes, we will provide the document or our paper on the payment behavior in Sint Maarten. It's on our website, but we can obviously also share with you. If you go to the website, it's on payment, and then the report is there. So the policy change, and that was a more fundamental question that you asked. So why is it not possible to give a bank account to undocumented persons in Sint Maarten? Because before that used to be possible. And I think the answer is actually the requirements from our correspondent banks. So the correspondent banks and also we ourselves have put more requirements in and require a piece of legal identification and proof of address because in the end we need to comply with the regulation of the FATF. And so if we wouldn't do that, we would run into difficulty with these requirements, and that could still be manageable, but losing your correspondent banks would not be manageable at this point. So I think that is the most important thing that changed, because I mean the FATF started in 1993 or something, but I mean they have become more elaborated in their recommendations and requirements and more detailed. So the transition period will be 30 years. I mean the real transition period will hopefully be 1 year, and the even more direct transition period is 3 months. Because the most easy way to exchange your Antillian guilders, I would think, is just go to a shop, pay with Antillian guilders, and you get Caribbean guilders back. And so I guess that's possible in the first 3 months. I guess that will be getting most of the Antillian guilders for most people out of their wallets. But obviously people that keep larger sums at home, they will want to go to their commercial bank. So that transition period will be 1 year. Then I will move to the questions of Member of Parliament, Ms. Wescot-Williams. First of all, thank you very much for sharing the link. And so the first question, and the most important, or an important question, is this: did we pass the point of no return? And so the question is, or the answer is yes, in two ways. I mean, we passed it in a way when accepting the legislation in 2009, and we passed it again when we signed the contracts with our suppliers, incurring financial obligations. But in practical terms, we also passed it because we really cannot wait any longer, because we need banknotes to make sure that circulation remains solid and people have enough banknotes and coins in their wallets to do their shopping and make their payments. So the legislation, it's mostly landsbesluithoudende algemene maatregelen that will specify exactly the characteristics of the notes and coins and that set the dates. All legislation that is in the area of the members of Parliament has been passed. The only change that we will make is that we would like to change the currency code from CMG to XCG, and I think there's another thing on a muntteken that is not exactly right in the law. So there might be a few changes, but we won't push that this will be changed all before the introduction date, because then it becomes too sensitive in a way, the timeline. And this is a military operation, so once we set the date, we really don't want to have any deviation of this and be very precise in our timeline. I was trying to see if we have any comparative numbers of other countries. I will look a little bit further. I know Aruba has also published something on the financial inclusion. I've seen some of other countries. I think 70% unbanked is high, but it's not high compared to some other countries in the region. But I don't have the numbers, so we will share afterwards and look again whether we see some other comparative studies on this number. And so the question on the one-on-one exchange rate, I think I have addressed. And there was a question by Mr. Bailani on how this will work for businesses, but I'm not entirely sure whether I completely understood this question. So I was wondering whether maybe Ms. Lofa Wong could answer this question, Madam Chair. So can I give the floor to Ms. Lofa Wong to answer the question on Member of Parliament, Mr. Bailani, and then I have answered all the questions. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Dornbusch. Ms. Lofa Wong, you have the floor.
Yes, MP Bailani, you asked whether or not businesses need to go to their commercial bank for the exchange to happen from ANG to XCG. No, that will be a hard switch. So the day that we transition over, that will be automatically done and changed in the systems. You also mentioned, you asked the questions of which countries will be adapting the Caribbean Guilder other than Curacao and St. Maarten. The Caribbean Guilder will only be adopted by Curacao and St. Maarten. We have gone back, because this is a question that we have asked Caribbean Guilder, but it's only 2 countries. We have looked back and we saw that when you choose a currency and a name for a currency, when you're dealing with multiple countries, you have to look for a common denominator. And the common denominator that was at that time is that both countries are in the Caribbean. So that's why the name of Caribbean Guilder was chosen. As a reference point, if you look at the Eastern Caribbean currency, it's not all countries in the Eastern Caribbean are part of the Eastern Caribbean currency unit as well. And that's it.
Thank you very much for answering all the questions, Ms. Lofa Wong and Mr. Dornbush. Before we move on to the second agenda point, I see that both MP Wescot-Williams and MP Bryson have requested the floor. I am going to end it there so that we can move on to the second agenda point. So hope there's no objections with that. Thank you. MP Wescot-Williams, you have the floor.
Thank you once again, Madam Chairleader. And just briefly, because my comment that I wanted to make, I think Mr. Dornbush has sort of addressed it, because I wanted to say to the response by the minister regarding the go, no-go statement, that I think the minister missed the gist of my question by referring to when the decision was taken or the intention was expressed. I know of all of that, but I think Mr. Dornbush better responded in terms of like right now and what is necessary, and where the 2 governments now decided, yes, based on all that you presented, we got to go. So I think the question, my comment to in response to the minister has been addressed by Mr. Dornbush, and the reason for that question about right now has to do with different sentiments coming from the different shareholders at different points in time. And that's why I wanted to make sure that at least on this item, shareholders are, that was the gist of my question. But I thank you, Mr. Dornbush sort of responded what I wanted to hear or get at. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Thank you, MP Wescott-Williams. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chair Lady. It was really just to mention that in first answering the questions, they mentioned some of the information based on what would not be answered would be sent in writing. For me in particular, 2 things that would be interesting to get in writing from them would be, firstly, maybe a bit of a, I mean, it doesn't have to be a whole study or report, but maybe a little bit of some insight into that discussion of whether it should be, if we should reconsider the PEG, maybe a list of pros and cons, 1-to-1, whether that's, what's the pros or cons can be on that. And maybe also a better elucidation into the pros and cons of having a 1 cent. I mean, there probably is a cost involved. I think it's totally impractical. Even if someone decides they want to list something for 99 cents, I'm sure no one is going to the store and say, hey, where's my 1 cent? You know, it's really just a promotional gimmick. You can ask for your 1 cent? Well, we have 1 person in the entire country. I think probably the minister himself probably go ask for the 1 cent, knowing him, but but I'm just saying that's normally a promotional thing. And as a matter of fact, in the Netherlands, they even adopted new policies where stores are allowed by law to round up or down on a cash payment. So you still, if it's an electronic payment, you get exactly down to the cent. But in the Netherlands, if you pay cash, the store is not obligated to give you back the 1 cent, even though there is a €1 So just some reconsiderations on that, if that can also be sent on writing, some pros and cons on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Bryson, and thank you to the members of Parliament for your questions, as well as to the representatives of Central Bank for your answers, and the Minister as well. I look to you one more time, Mr. Dornbush, to see if you have any comments before we move on to the second agenda point. Just to recap for the record that the remaining questions will come in writing from you or the Minister of Finance. Do you need the floor?
Yeah, just to specify that only those two questions are remaining, right?
No problem.
Yeah.
And it is noted. Thank you very much. With that, we move on to agenda point number 2, developments of and at the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten. Parliament received a letter on March 27, 2023, from MP S.A Wescot-Williams, which is noted as IS/651, 2022 to 2023, with the request that a meeting of the committee be convened with the aforementioned agenda point. At the time of the request, at the time of making the meeting request, there were some disturbing reports / allegations, especially in the Curacao media, regarding appointment of board members and alleged discord between board members and shareholders, reports of investigations into the board of directors, financial management of the CBCS. While most of these are on political or ministerial levels, MP Wescott had put in her request to get some assurances from the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten that there is no reason for concern and that the bank's finances are solid. Before I pass on the floor to MP Wescot-Williams, I would like to note to the members that received a copy of this letter via email, and they can also find that on the P drive of Parliament. At this time, I would first like to give the floor to the requester of this agenda point, MP Wescot-Williams. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. And indeed, Madam Chair Lady, you correctly summed up my response to the question that I posed initially regarding the central bank, and that was just recent developments. And as I stated in my subsequent request, the concerns at the time, approximately 2 months ago, had to do with many media reports, especially on the island of Curacao, with respect to the central bank, board of directors, shareholders, etc. And so I elucidated on that request, and as you started, Madam Chair Lady, indeed, the appointment of board members and alleged discord between board members and shareholders, reports of investigations into the board of directors and the financial management of the CBCS. And then you mentioned about it being primarily on a political ministerial level. And what I actually wanted to know, and that's again, to use the word, the gist of my question, I just wanted to know from the central bank where we stand. In addition to that, this was playing out at a time that internationally, we had different banking issues in the limelight. And I wanted to know if, and if so, what implications would these have had, not only for the central bank, but the banking sectors in the countries run or managed by the central bank. So, as I summed it up in my request, if the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten could give some level of comfort from the bank in these turbulent financial times. That's the way I summed up my questions about what's happening. Correspondent banking issues, are they related to any of what played out on the international banking scene? So, Madam Chair Lady, that's where I wanted to go. 2 months ago, I wanted to hear from the central bank reps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MP Wescot-Williams. And the reason I wanted to save my questions for the second agenda point is while this agenda point it would have appeared a little bit general, I didn't want us to duplicate my question or the clarification by MP Wescot-Williams for the first agenda point as well as the second agenda point. And as you just heard from MP Wescot-Williams, it was certain developments that, of course, we are also paying attention to. It does affect us. It is, after all, the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten. At the same time, while we are here at getting a presentation of the Caribbean Gilder for the changeover, learning again, or if not knowing that before, to the persons that are viewing and listening into this meeting, that we are indeed pegged to the dollar. And like you rightfully said earlier on when we were discussing the first agenda point, Mr. Dornbusch, that we are affected by any events that happen globally, especially when we find ourselves pegged to the US dollar. And when you look at developments that are happening around the world, and I look to the vice chair of the Finance Committee, Mr. Pontiflet, who likes to, MP Pontiflet, my apologies, who likes to bring up the discussion of the BRICS group when it comes to emerging economies in the world. And the trend that you have been seeing last year is where there has been an increase in, while we all know that foreign relations is part of existing in today's global economy, and it's about maintaining those foreign relations, but even a little bit of a small island like Sint Maarten is heavily affected and by those decisions that happen globally. And when you are seeing in the last 13 years, a growing or an emergence of BRICS and application of countries that are looking to BRICS and kind of steering away a little bit from the US dollar, you do start to pay attention of how this is going to affect our country that is pegged to the US dollar. And when I mention BRICS, for those persons that are tuned in, BRICS is the emerging economies represented by that acronym of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And there are numerous countries that have been applying to be members of BRICS. And please, as I am talking, I'm stating this at a very, very high level without trying to give a position on where I stand in the BRICS influence in global politics. What you are seeing is an increase in cooperation and communication that is happening by France with their interaction with a BRICS member in China. We are sharing this island with the French side, which is part of France. And they are looking at it, and I want to actually quote, when you look at BRICS, it says it's a emerging economies group that is there to promote peace, security, development, and cooperation. And that is exactly what is happening with the trend that I'm seeing. So you're seeing France building relationships with China and doing so under the guise of, under the cooperation with the need to do it under, let's say, energy. They're doing it under energy agreements. They're doing it with FG developments. And then you also recently saw in the news, which is about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, you also saw the Prime Minister of the Netherlands going to visit Brazil and also engaging in energy-related, exactly this kind of security, development, and cooperation. So you're seeing a group that is basically always having strong relationships with the U.S., strong relationships with the US dollar, and you're seeing this kind of shift happening globally, which means that as this emerging group, emerging economies get stronger, the same thing that MP Wescot-Williams is saying, just a sense of security. I know that you are fully aware of that, both the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Sint Maarten and Curacao, but this does have a significant impact on us when there is any uncertainty that comes up because of countries moving away from the US dollar transaction. So when we're talking about that comfort, I want to know where does that thought process, where does that influence come in with how the central bank has its developments and what's happening internally, what they're doing. In addition to what MP Wescot-Williams said, you also had recently where you get this comfort when there's any uncertainty happening in the world, when you're dealing with economies, you see that people tend to go to the secure thing, which old-fashioned wise was always gold reserves. And that's what came up again recently in the news, where you have someone saying that we should sell our gold reserves. If you see the trend happening globally where people are sort of shifting away from a US dollar, the security you have and the comfort and stability you give to an economy is that gold reserves, then the last thing that most economists would do is tell you to sell your gold reserves because it gives you some strength, some comfort. And in fact, when you are dealing with uncertain times globally, you actually see people happening after the global financial crisis. They actually start increasing their gold reserves. So I know that that's a lot of information, and I say it because the public is tuning in. The public needs to be aware of how anything that is happening globally, specifically with France and the Netherlands, and how their relationships in the country is changing, that we also pay attention to what is happening here, and that we concern ourselves with the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten, making sure that we are secured, that we have our security, and that we will continue to maintain that security and not potentially use gold reserves to go finance projects that they were not allowed to touch anyways with our gold reserves. So I hope that clarifies it for all of us. And before I continue and I give you back the floor, I look to MP Rumu for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. It is not a question, it is actually a clarification, because Mr. Dornbusch indicated that there were only 2 questions left to be answered, but quite a number of my questions were not answered. So I would just like you to know that when you're sending the answers in writing, that is taken into consideration. They have already been forwarded to the minister. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Rumu. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady, for that introduction. And I think considering, the subject of recent developments, I would like to ask about the most recent development that I've read of. And unfortunately, it does seem that the Parliament of St. Maarten has to learn of positions of the kingdom. And I would even think maybe the government of St. Maarten has to learn of these things in the media, in sort of digital press conferences and so on. But apparently, there was recently such a digital press conference from the State Secretary of the Netherlands. And the media, it was reported in the Daily Herald, where I can quote, negatively affecting the retirement pension of about 30,000 people living mainly in Curacao and St. Maarten, the problems and pension insurer Enya are a societal issue that also pose a risk to these countries' budgets, warned State Secretary for Kingdom Relations Alexandra van Huffelen. The governments of both Curacao and St. Maarten has been asked to come up with a solution. And apparently, what we get from the gist of that is that St. Maarten and our liquidity loans that have nothing to do with Enya, that has nothing to do with any sort of negligence on behalf of the government of St. Maarten. There is a procedure that's happening both in the Parliament and within CBCS that's investigating those issues. But what I think we can say is that it is not the government of St. Maarten, or for that matter, the government of Curacao, that directly supervises insurance companies and banks. That is a responsibility of the independent institution that is the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten. And for whatever reason, over 30 years or more, with that supervision, something has gone amiss. And today we have to hear, or this week we have to hear, that now liquidity loans that are there to help the people on the basis of mutual assistance that went towards helping during a time of a pandemic, those are now being put in the same bucket as a situation that went wrong at a private company by gross negligence of people that own the company and manage the company. I would like to ask from the minister, if it is, I know for sure probably the central bank is going to be very limited in what they can comment on this. But I would like at least some sort of synopsis from the central bank. But from our minister, has the government discussed this? Are there any thoughts he can share on this? Because my thoughts is that this is extremely unfortunate, to be nice, but I would say hypocritical if I say what I'm really feeling in my heart. Because that is a private company that we're talking about 30,000 people at risk. For years, St. Maarten has made efforts to try to solve a situation at our own social insurance company where probably close to 20,000 people are at risk. And what are we told to do? We're told to raise the ceiling, the SZV limit, introduce higher premiums by means of this, all kinds of other things, come with all kind of creative ways that the operations of that company will find a way to sustain itself without risking loans, without any of those type of conditions. But interestingly, for a private company, we have a state secretary stepping in all of a sudden to say the government has to come up with a solution. When the same government has been told in the past, do not interfere with the central bank, arm's length approach with these government institutions. I would like to hear from the minister on this. And for the life of me, something I can't understand, and this is public information, there is a court case that took place and a judgment has been rendered in the situation of Enya during the, let me just quote exactly what I'm referring to be exact, November the 29th, 2021. This very infamous court case that took place where the central bank under administrative action won against the plaintiffs, including Mr. Hushang Ansari. And in this vonnis, it says very clearly under 6.11, verklaart dit vonnis uitvoerbaar bij voorraad for an estimation of over 1 billion guilders. If I understand correctly, that means regardless of an appeal, regardless of an appeals process, the plaintiff can start to execute, for example, having a deurwaarde. For example, I have here from a source from the University of Leiden where they explain what is uitvoerbaar bij voorraad. De mogelijkheid om een uitspraak meteen uit te voeren, ook als hoger beroep wordt ingesteld op de hoofdprocedure nog doorloopt. So I would like to ask, isn't that the solution? That's not a solution government has to come up with. There is a decision of the courts. Why are we not collecting? Why are we not placing liens? Why are we not seizing jets and seizing hotels and seizing accounts and solving this situation the right way? That is what I would like to know from the government and the central bank. In terms of another recent development, hopefully maybe more on a positive note, I mentioned earlier about the right to basic bank account. That's some legislation that is on its way from what we've heard earlier. But I would also like to ask maybe more recently, are there any updates on other legislation that might be coming from the central bank? And also, I didn't find it on your website, but when normally would the 2022 annual report or financial statements of the central bank come out? This kind of ties back into the previous question because we see, for example, that 15 million guilders is going to be spent on coming up with a new Caribbean guilder. There are other expenses that have to come forward. But when I look at the 2021 financial statements, we saw a loss of, I think it was around 2.5 million in 2021 and then 3-point-something million in 2020. So obviously the years of when, let's say if you go back to the 2019 financial statements where you saw profits of, or let's say net income of 5 million and in 1 year 20 million, that's no longer the case. So how is the central bank looking financially? How are you able to operate? Is the central bank needing to draw in on other loans or other cash flow to be able to do things like paying for the Caribbean guilder, all the legislation that you're doing? How are you operating, having sustained these losses over the last year? What is the current cash position of the central bank to be able to operate? And how is the outlook of the financial strength of the central bank going forward? I would like an updated position, if any, on the central bank in terms of the procedure for the subscription/issuing of bonds by the government of St. Maarten. We recall a situation where a bond was being prepared to be floated. Suddenly the CFT came out with their opinion, I would say opinion, because that is their interpretation of the law. Does the central bank have a sort of their own interpretation and understanding as to what the procedure would be for St. Maarten to engage in issuing bonds in order to bring in money for the country? Is that indeed something that requires the Rijksministerraad support? Does that require CFT's approval? Let's say from the perspective of the central bank, looking at the legislation that falls under you, your own interpretation of what the law states. And I would also like to ask, within the central bank, the shareholder situation where you have two shareholders. We had the example of where, okay, one shareholder says the 1 cent coin, the other doesn't. How does it exactly work in terms of decision-making between equal shareholders? Is it based on shares, or is it really like a 50-50 decision? Does it have to be a unanimous decision? How does the shareholder meeting work? That is something that I've always wondered, or is it just kind of understood that they will always try to find a way to come to an agreement, but is on paper, what is the way this actually should function? And that'll be all for now, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Bryson. MP Pontiflet, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief because, Madam Chair, you perfectly express things that I've been saying and thinking about for quite a long time. I can recall, Madam Chair, when in 2021, I believe Director Mr. Boris was here, and I asked the question about the issue of the same BRICS countries and the stability of the dollar because we are pegged to the dollar, and the possible potential of countries gearing more towards the to be established, let me use this term, new currency, and about the countries that are requesting to be added to the BRICS countries. And I believe, if I'm incorrect, Minister, Chair Lady, that Mr. Dornbush can tell me, I believe I was told that he believed that the US dollar is going to be strong for the next 50 years, or that has been stable. We have a stable currency because it was pegged to the US dollar for 50 years. So I don't know if he said that it's going to be strong for 50 years more, or it has been that case. Why do I mention that? Because, again, it is our responsibility as members of Parliament to have vision. And I always tell the people of St. Maarten, we cannot only look at what is taking place on St. Maarten or in the region, because Ukraine war is so many thousands of miles away, but we have been impacted negatively by that war in Ukraine. So we have to look at what's happening in the world also, not only on St. Maarten or in the region. Now, I had a little suggestion, which I'll share now. And again, one of the things I've learned, when you ask a question or make a statement, there are those who might think it's foolish or whatever. Let me use a phrase my wife says I shouldn't use too much. I really don't care, because the fact is, very often I make a little phrase or something years in the past, and I see it repeated or come into fruition in the present, and I smile. Is it wrong for us, for the central bank or whatever, to open an account in yen, in the Chinese currency? Is it possible? Because we see where China is going, and I think that we have to prepare ourselves now and not wait until tomorrow. Again, Madam Chair, I really want to thank you, because I could not have said it better than that. A question that I had for the other agenda point, but maybe it can be asked now, and if it can be answered now, I'll accept it later, it in writing, is the value of the gold. Who looks at the value of gold when it goes up? What does it do to our reserves? Because in my humble opinion, I believe if it's pegged at a certain amount and it goes up, isn't there a way for the extra amount to be taken and put in a savings account or whatever, and the central bank Curacao St. account? Is that possible? Because I know gold doesn't remain fixed all the time. So that's my opinion, not being an economist, but looking at things that are happening worldwide. I think that's it so far, Madam Chair, because I said you really, as you would say, hit the nail on the head. And I just read the response. Oh, yes. What's our reserve at the present moment? What is the reserve right now at our central bank as it relates to the foreign currency, and the fact that we we do most of our purchases in US dollars. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Pontiflet. Before I give the floor back over to central bank representatives, I would like to take a brief break, no more than 5 minutes, as we are strapped for time. Meeting adjourned for 5 minutes. Welcome back to this Committee of Finance meeting. I look to Mr. Dornbush. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of Parliament, for all those very good questions. I think we would need 5 hours to really debate these questions, and I have 15 minutes, so you have to apologize that it's going to be quite short in answering. First of all, Member of Parliament, Ms. Wescot-Williams, asked for assurances, and so I'd like to give these assurances that the cooperation between the Executive Board of the Central Bank, between the Executive Board and the Supervisory Board, and between the Executive Board, Supervisory Board and the shareholder is very good. Obviously, sometimes news comes out, and I'm also surprised sometimes what kind of news comes out and where this is coming from, but I can assure you that this cooperation is good. It's also true that there's not that much in the governance system of the central bank there's not much contact with the shareholder. That's really on arm's length. It's more of the contact with the Minister of Finance in his capacity as legislator, in his capacity or in our capacity as advisor to the government, and so it's mostly on other issues than as a shareholder of the central bank. And then there was a reference to the banking turmoil that we have seen and are still seeing in the region, and in particular in the United States of America, and how vulnerable we are to this banking turmoil. And obviously there's different channels of contagion from this banking turmoil to our jurisdictions. And I often summarize them in 3. The first channel is just the economy. So interest rates have been hiked by the major central banks, which is done to reduce inflation, but also to reduce economic activity, because that is creating the pressure on prices. And so it might lead to a recession that might have an impact on the economy. Tourism's coming to Sint Maarten, and that will definitely a source of contagion also coming from this hikes in interest rates that is responsible for the financial turbulence in the United States. The second contagion channel is, are there financial institutions that have similar business models that brought these institutions, regional banks, into problems? And then I would say that the business models of our financial institutions are quite distinctly different. So what we have seen is that these banks, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic Bank, they had quite a large exposure to foreign investments or investments in fixed income securities, let's put it that way. So United States bonds, other bonds of large countries, and those have dropped quite dramatically in value because of the rise in the interest rate. A second reason why they were vulnerable is that the depositor base was quite concentrated, and mostly concentrated in uninsured deposits, and that created a flight of these deposits to other institutions when these problems arise. And thirdly, their capital was much lower than the capital that we are seeing. So on all the 3 accounts, we have distinctly different financial institutions, because the exposure is from our banks is mostly in just ordinary loans to consumers that have a very different behavior, that have floating exchange rate most of the time. So this vulnerability is not there on the asset side. On the liability side, the deposit base is quite diversified, which makes it less likely that this depositor flight will arise. And what we've seen is that capital adequacy has increased, so the requirement is 10.5%, and in reality it's 21% on average in our jurisdiction. So the capital base is strong. But obviously we need to monitor this very closely, because we are a small island. We are very dependent on what happens around us. So the third contagion channel is like confidence. So we have to make sure that confidence in our system remains, and that is not a source of contagion. So next to this reassuring message, we do see a lot of risks. And these risks, they relate also to the issues addressed by the Madam Chair, the issues addressed by Mr. Pantoflet, is that obviously there is geopolitically a divergence going on between the old blocs of the United States and the friends of the United States, and let's put them the BRIC countries. And this kind of French shoring that is being debated about, where value change move, and that some of the operations are being changed from China back to maybe the United States or other factors that are at play, will have an impact to global trade. And global trade always have an impact on economic growth, and economic growth also will impact the economies of Sint Maarten. Do I feel that is the biggest risk? No, I don't think so. The biggest risk that we see is more coming from the financial side, from the higher interest rate. That will have an immediate impact on the economy of the US. That is the one that we are most vulnerable to, and that is going to be the biggest risk for our economies. The second biggest risk, or a very large risk that we see, is climate change still. We don't see sufficient action being taken. We see weather patterns changing. We see reinsurance premiums going up. Very important for a country as Sint Maarten. The other one that we highlighted as that we see is rising is for actually cybersecurity risks. So in the pandemic, we've seen that financial institutions have become much more vulnerable, not vulnerable, but being attacked by cyber criminals. And so they have had to increase their cyber defense. That is costly, and activity is only increasing. That is something that we are quite concerned about in actual risks that we see. And so the debate was also referring to our position in gold, so the gold of the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten, and some questions that arise around this. I mean, this is there for a reason. The reserve position in gold is because it behaves quite distinctly different from other reserves. We don't want to sell any gold or decrease our position in gold without the full backing of the governments, and therefore we decided to just keep the gold as it is now, so exactly the same 420 million troy ounce, because we don't want to have any speculation or debate about this reserve position in gold. And the reason why this is because we want to make absolutely sure that we can keep the fixed exchange rate backed, as we discussed also in our previous agenda point. So I think that was an important part of the first debate. Then Mr. Bryson had 5 sets of questions. I take the easy one first. So updates on other legislation. So we have still payment legislation that is important in the legislative process. That's there, I think, since 2021. It is important because that's going to be introducing supervision on virtual asset service providers, on other payment oversight, and so we hope that this will progress in the coming year towards fruition and being sent to you. The annual report will become available in July, we expect. We're finishing it up, and so we're going to send it shortly to the Board of Supervisory, and then it has to go to the shareholders meeting, and then it will be published. So hopefully this will be done in July. I mean, the decision-making between the shareholders is mostly by consent, so there's really no voting rule. And the procedure of issuing bonds is that this is really a decision by the governments. And the government, we just act as a debt management agency. So if we get the request to issue a bond, we will issue the bond. And it is true that the opinion of the CFT is important in the sense that the interest in such a bond is very reliant on this opinion. So if there is an approved budget, then there is certainly the obligation for the government of the Netherlands through the standing subscription to take up the bond, but also the interest on local financial parties will be much higher if there is an approved budget and the loan that is being issued is based on this approved budget. So ENIA is also brought up. This is certainly a very important issue for the central bank. We are working hard to come to a restructuring of ENIA to make sure that the policy holders of ENIA are not being cut. This is not easy because, as we have seen in the court case documents, there is an important solvency shortage in the company, and this is obviously our primary strategy is to get this money back from those that withdrew these funds illegally as being convicted by the court. The verdict is indeed uitvoerbaar bij voorraad. That is a very good thing, but at the same time, the assets are mostly in the United States, and so we are filing procedures by the court in Texas and the court in California, and that takes longer than expected than to have these court cases recognized by these courts in Texas and the court in California to make sure that we can actually indeed execute the verdict. And maybe one important remark there, why is there a discussion with the governments, which I'm not going to go into detail about, is that it takes time. So the strategy seems really to take as much legislative measures and sort of legalize the proceeding as much as possible. So that is the strategy of Parman and Mr. Ansari. And it takes a lot of time. And so we don't have this time. So, we want that there is a solution for those that are reliant on, for their pension on ENIA, to be able to get this pension also in the time that we are going after the funds that are being held in the United States by Mr. Ansari. So, Mr. Member of Parliament, Mr. Pantoflet, referred back to a discussion we had on the position of the US dollar as a reserve currency, and my statement, I don't think I said this is going to be safe for 50 years. I think the 50 years was that we had a solid fixed exchange rate system for 50 years, or since 50 years. I do remember that I referred back to the reserve position of the US dollar only slowly declining. So what we have seen is that there are indeed changes in the reserve position of the US dollar, and that's often measured by the reserve position of the US dollar in the portfolio of central banks around the world. And the data that we have on this comes mostly from these central banks around the world, and we see that that's not as much as you would expect maybe. Even with the introduction of the euro 20 years ago, it didn't make a large change. We do see that there is a little bit more holdings of the yen in the portfolios of central bank, but then that's around 2.5%, whereas if US dollar is still above 50%, close to 60, if I remember correctly. So is it possible to open an account in yen at the banks? I would not know the answer to this question. In theory it is, but I'm not so sure if any bank is interested in opening a bank account in yen to their clients. So I would not have the answer on this question. So what do we do when the value of gold changes? Of course, the value of gold changes every day on the market. And so what happens is that we adjust our appropriate reserves for this. So on the balance sheet of the central bank is an appropriate reserve. And so if the value of gold rises, then the value in this appropriate reserve goes up. If the value declines, the value of the gold in the appropriate reserve goes down, and in that way we secure it that it's not being touched and doesn't influence our results. So what is the reserve position right now? So we have a foreign reserve position of around 2.9 billion. That's it's a dollar position, but it's expressed in Antillean guilder if I say 2.9, and the position in gold is around 1.2 billion in Antillean guilders, 1.2, 1.3 if I remember correctly. So with that, it is 12:05. So if possible, I would like to leave for the airport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dornbusch, for answering the questions, and thank you to the members of Parliament for those questions. I smiled when you were referring to my abundance of information that I let out, because I remember specifically when the central bank had a report in April 21, after the IMF came in to look at the management of the central bank, that one of their recommendations was to decrease their gold reserves. And the reason I brought that up was because of that suggestion 2 years ago when we're dealing with uncertainty in financial markets. So I appreciate very much your consistency in the answers and being so thorough with the information that you share here in this proceeding. Hence the smile, because you brought it all back together. With that, we have reached the end of discussion on agenda point number 2. I would like, sorry? I didn't say, I apologize. If it is okay, I would like to adjourn the meeting to let Mr. Dornbusch leave because he has a flight to catch. And then I would kindly ask the minister for your indulgence here for a few more minutes. We can discuss this over the break. Meeting adjourned. Before I adjourn that meeting, thank you very much, Mr. Dornbusch and Ms. Raquel Lofowong of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Maarten for being here today on your presentation on the Caribbean Guilder. And this meeting is adjourned for 5 minutes. Welcome back to this Committee of Finance meeting. We move on to agenda point number 3, the way forward for Parliament on tax reform, which is identified by IS/651/2022 to 2023, dated March 27, 2023. In the same letter of March 27, 2023, MP Wescot-Williams also requested for the aforementioned agenda point to be discussed in a meeting of this committee. At this time, I would like to give MP Wescot-Williams the floor for any further details on the request, the agenda point.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady, and a good afternoon once again. A good afternoon to the Minister who has remained, along with his support staff, my colleagues, and those still tuned in to this meeting. Madam Chair Lady, the reason why I mentioned in the request for, and some would say another request on tax reform by MP Wescott, has to do with the fact that in early February, I believe it was, maybe on the 8th, if I recall the date well, the minister was in Parliament based on requests by this member and other members of Parliament to discuss the plans and the discussions and the positions on tax reform. At the time, the minister presented us with a very short presentation, and I must add here that he did elucidate some of what we saw in the presentation under the different taxes and proposed reform to these taxes. So, for example, we received a presentation that said lowering of the profit tax, and then in verbalizing this, the minister gave some information. However, the entire matter of tax reform, as everyone knows, is part of the country package. And the country package has several steps listed to be undertaken by the government with respect to tax reform. And it was announced and subsequently is mentioned that the Parliament has handled this using the Dutch beslissnota on tax reform. And my question, therefore, would be, what is the meeting of the 8th of February on tax reform in Parliament? What is that meeting considered? Is it considered that the points and proposals brought forward by the minister during that meeting, that these have the approval by Parliament? Was approval even necessary? Because the discussion in Parliament on this note, on this proposal, on this beslissnota, is considered a step in the process to come to tax reform as listed in the country package. If that is the case, then my humble suggestion would be that, 1, the minister provides much of the additional information that he gave verbally on the different taxes, that the minister provides those to Parliament. So to give an example of what I'm saying, the outline that the minister gave with respect to his proposal for profit tax, if we can get that outline, if we can get an outline, and that then Parliament can have a discussion. What do we think about the proposal for the minister on profit tax? What do we think? You know, and all of the taxes as mentioned. And so that's why I say the way forward. Where do we go with the proposal on the table, which was, according to me, the last one presented by the minister was the one of February of this year. And I just wanted to have a more in-depth discussion on the proposals of the minister with respect to tax reform. And I can imagine, Madam Chair Lady, that given the other activities that we have for today, maybe this discussion would have to be postponed, but I hope the idea of where I wanted to go with this discussion, I hope that is made clear, and that's why I use the word the way forward. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady, for allowing me to elucidate my request for this meeting, which, like the previous one, is already of like maybe nearly about 2 months ago. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Thank you, MP Wescott-Williams. Originally, when we opened this meeting, it was the intention for us to adjourn both the central bank representatives as well as the Minister of Finance and his team. And I requested during the break for us to allow MP Wescott-Williams to elucidate on the reason for the agenda point. As it stands, we have all been invited to go to the integrity symposium that is happening today. So this is why we were a little bit tight with our time. But I will look to the minister really quickly if you would like to clarify anything on this agenda point number 3. And Minister, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. And the last comment was that this meeting was requested 2 months ago. I'd like to again state that I believe when I check the records again, for the Ministry of Finance, we had one outstanding meeting, I think, and it was a recent meeting that was booked. And every meeting that is called to be attended as fast as we can. In addition to that, we've had a few task meetings already, and in the last meeting of Parliament, and we could go back and check the notes, where we clearly stated also that this is the opportunity for the members of Parliament to give their feedback, their concerns, and so forth, and any of these will then be taken up into the process. And after this meeting, we would then continue the trajectory of the law. So all of the points that the MP is discussing, the opportunity still lies there because we have to bring the laws to Parliament. Just like the laws of NHI and so forth, Parliament didn't sit with the minister at every discussion of every point in the law in here. And we've also discussed that Parliament among themselves, actually the MPs brought it forward, that the Parliament among themselves would like to discuss certain taxes and so forth and potentially send them on. So I really don't get the points about at every proposal bringing it to Parliament, because that's not part of our trajectory. And I don't think that has been the trajectory of Parliament at all when it comes to legislation.
Thank you, Minister, for the answer. I wanted to make a note, MP Bryson, I do see that you have your request for it, and I believe it relates to the question that was pending from the second agenda point. Is that correct? Okay, I will pass on the floor to you, and MP Wescott, you will be next. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, it's actually related to this this agenda point because in preparing for this meeting, I took note of the letter and the request. And the request actually from MP Wescott-Williams was for 2 agenda points, which was the developments at the central bank, which we've handled that one. And then the second point was the way forward for Parliament on tax reform. And then it says, I look forward to the presence of a CBCS representative for agenda point 1. So it didn't ask for the presence of the minister. So when I see that, I say, okay, the idea with this then, we're preparing for a discussion amongst members of Parliament regarding tax reform. So that's what I've prepared for in terms of this meeting. Then I also look at like what the minister mentioned. In the last meeting, and this has happened before, the NHI is a good example. The Minister of P.Y22-23 came, he presented, let's say, a framework of, well, these are some of the highlights and what we're looking at. Of course, in the legislative trajectory, you never get all of the exact points and so on, but you get at least the highlights of, well, this is what we're looking at in terms of a general health insurance. And what I think we got for tax reform is these are the highlights of what we're looking to change within our tax system. In that meeting, let's say, for example, with regards to the profit tax, I recall different advices or concerns being brought forward by MP Bijlani regarding the profit tax, what we should look at, how we should adjust the rate, how the rate should be relative to the turnover tax, and various others that were brought up amongst other members. So what I understood from this meeting and what I think would be very effective is indeed that. I think if in this setting, and if it has to be adjourned and we come back or whatever, but this setting is another opportunity where our own ideas and visions, the different factions on, okay, this is what we think, this is something that the government should also consider, and then this, by the means of a decision list or whatever, is forwarded on to the government, that is something that can be effective use of the Committee of Finance, that they can see how they can take that up within their legislative trajectory. And that's what really I would want to contribute in this meeting if that's what we're doing. Generally, at least from our faction, like I mentioned, we have already given our feedback in that previous meeting in terms of tax reform. I more want to comment on where we can supplement, let's say as Parliament, at least our faction. We've looked at areas that I believe are sort of quick wins that may not fall within the trajectory of what the government is already doing. And those two in particular are the hotel tax. This is something that doesn't really fall, let's say, within the general tax ordinance. So it's not one of those taxes that the vast majority of the population pays. It is a very specific heffing that is placed on specific businesses. So we have a vision for what that should entail. We believe that there should be a structural increase of the hotel tax to get closer to the Caribbean average, which is currently 13%. I believe over the next, over a period of 6 years at a rate of, let's say, I believe what we've drafted is 8% by 2024, 10% by 2026, and 12% by 2028. We have actually had, as a faction, discussions with the SHT as a stakeholder to see how they feel about that. And one of the things they brought forward is, okay, they do understand that we have the lowest hotel tax in the Caribbean. There is room to increase it, especially if it's done in a structured way like that. But the sort of trade-off should be that there needs to be a more direct manner in making sure that the what we call the sharing economy, so the Airbnb, VRBO, and so on, are integrated into it as well. So one of the changes to the law that we propose is that you actually define specifically ODMs within the law so that it's very clear and gives an avenue for the minister to be able to sign tax collection agreements with these entities directly. Currently, our legislation does not allow for that. The SHTA actually informed us by letter that they had verified this with Baker Tilly, who did a study of the tax, the logeergastenbelastinglandsverordening, to see, is there room for tax collection agreements? Right now, there's not. There is room for the ministry, which they're doing, to be able to go and get people to pay based on the fact that it is income and they have to pay. What I'm specifically talking about is going a step further and having those entities remitted directly to the government. That's a change that I think should be incorporated. So those changes to the logeergastenbelasting law are one. The other that we have actually now submitted for via the Minister of Finance, we've asked the Fiscal Affairs Department to review that, and that would be a tax incentive for graduating students.
MP Bryson?
Yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
It looks like we're going on with agenda point 3 as is normal, and I wanted to actually, not to interrupt you, round it off to allow the minister to leave. So that means that we are going to have to take an adjournment to allow the Minister of Finance to leave and decide amongst ourselves if we're going to continue with agenda point number 3 here today, which means none of you will be able to attend the Integrity Symposium. So I will take it to a vote after a 1-minute adjournment to allow the minister to go. Minister Arian, thank you very much for being here today with the Central Bank, answering the questions for us, and I wish you a good rest of the day and weekend as well. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned for 1 minute. Welcome back to this Committee of Finance meeting. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Well, Madam Chair, like you said, if the intention is that we would continue the discussion at another time, I mean, I've come prepared to, let's say, give on behalf of our faction the additional points we want to see. But if other members considering that the other event is at 1:30, I have no problem continuing our contribution at a later date.
Thank you, MP Bryson. Indeed, all of the points that you have made are noted. This discussion is one that is extremely important for our country, which is why I would still look to the floor at the members of parliament to see whether or not you want to continue this meeting today. I will give the floor briefly to MP Wescot-Williams, and then we're going to take a vote as to whether we continue this meeting today of agenda point number 3 on the tax reform, or we adjourn this meeting until a later date. MP Wescott, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Let me take a jump on your last question, and I would definitely be in favor of postponing this discussion for another time. And I say that, and also at the same time, and I had wanted to say this while the minister was here, but I did not want to interject you while you were taking leave of the minister, Madam Chair Lady, but the minister fell over my statement regarding from when this meeting request was, but it was not something directed to the minister. I made a statement again to elucidate the context in which the request was made. So, and the minister or his ministry were not responsible for this meeting taking place today. In fact, it had more to do with the availability of the reps of the central bank than it had to do with the minister, number one. Secondly, the speaker before me, indeed, and that was precisely the understanding that I have of the request that I made. You know, to have a discussion in Parliament, and my question or my remarks pertaining to what the minister presented had to do with the following. Yes, we should be discussing this issue on the specifics of it, on the different taxes, new, to be amended, whatever have you. However, the minister did provide information regarding what we received on paper. Now one can say, yeah, go back, go look at a meeting and then note down what the minister says that he sees, you know. But why can't the minister just give, you know, exactly what he stated? Just give pointers. But if the minister say, no, I don't have to do that, I'm going to wait to send you the legislation, which he has stated before, well, I mean, it's not an issue for me, whichever way. I just thought that that would be helpful in the discussion by members of parliament. And indeed, again, as the speaker before me stated, it had the intention was that Parliament has that discussion. I just thought that we could have some more of what the government is working on, because this is what the government is discussing with stakeholders and whoever else have you going forward. But saying all of that, just to clarify my request for this agenda point 1, and to say that I would support that we have that discussion you know, at some other time, because I would be one of those who would unfortunately have to take an early leave. So, Madam Chair Lady, thanks again.
Thank you, MP Wescott-Williams. I look to the floor at the members of parliament to have a show of hands to see who would like to postpone this meeting, because I am very close to keeping the agenda point on.
Madam Chair, a bit of a point of order, because if we're going to come back to this meeting, then I think it also needs to be clear. I think we're on the same page, the request and myself, in terms of the intention of the meeting itself, but what is expected of the government in terms of getting pointers. Because for me, when I read it and I prepared for the meeting, I went back to the meeting that was held. I looked at the pointers, if we call them that the minister gave, the discussion from the ministers of parliament, the answers then received. So for me, I have received, let's say, sufficient information from the government on, well, this is what they want to do with tax reform, the pointers? Is it that we still actually are saying, no, we want more from the Minister of Finance, because then we'll come back again, and then it's like, oh no, but we didn't get what we want, just that the meeting is fruitful? Maybe we should be clear on that, but for me personally, I think we're ready to go with this debate. And the second point I want to caution on, Madam Chair, is that reference is made to, oh, the meeting is called 2 months later and so on. We have the meeting now, other than the fact that we have another engagement. Madam Chair, you have called a meeting and you're prepared to continue the discussion. But now, in approximately 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to be going on recess. We have other meetings that need to be called. So now there's a possibility that this meeting won't be called, until after the recess. So is it again going to be said, like some have gone in the newspaper and say procedure may call in meetings, although they're not here for this meeting, but is it going to be said again, oh, look at that, an important topic like tax reform is not being called? Let it be shown that members were here, ready to have the discussion on it. If we want to postpone it, no problem, but I hope now it's not going to be said that if this meeting is called after the recess, that it's the fault of the chair or the presidium or anyone else. That's a decision of the committee and those present here now. For me, I'm good either way.
Thank you, MP Bryson. As I said before, I look to the floor, I look to the members of Parliament with a show of hands on whether or not you agree to postpone this meeting to a later date or continue today, which is not a problem at all for the chair of this Committee of Finance. I look for a show of hands from the members of Parliament for those in favor of postponing the meeting. Six members have voted, which is the majority. This meeting is postponed until a later date. Thank you, members of Parliament. Thank you for those persons tuning in today.